what I'd like to do now is I'd like to take you over to your claim that 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35, that they are an intrusion or an addition on the text. First of all, what is your view as far as complementarian, egalitarian? Are you somewhere in between? Or before we really get into this discussion, I'd like to get our biases out. Yeah.
I began my study of man and woman in the New Testament because I heard a lecture at the beginning of my PhD studies at Cambridge, where the lecturer stated that there was no passage in the New Testament properly understood in its original context that limits the ministry of women. I almost stood up in the class and shouted, "That's not true." Right. And I determined I will prove him wrong. And it was in my determination to prove him wrong that I found that I was wrong. And but it took me about 7 years before I eventually, the data just accumulated, and eventually I had to change my mind. So I am now an egalitarian, but I didn't get there because I was trying to defend the egalitarian position. I got there because I was trying to defend the complementarian position.
Okay, good. Yeah. And so I would be on the more complementarian side of the discussion. So, let's get the gloves out. No, I'm just kidding. We're not gonna fight. But I'm genuinely interested to hear why you would come to the conclusion that these two passages are not scripture. So, I guess the main question is what makes you think that these are additions to the text? What would make you come to that conclusion?
11 external reasons and 10 internal reasons that I believe that text of 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35 was not in the original text of, I'm sorry, there are 10 external and 11 internal reasons.
Gotcha.
Why I believe it was not originally in Paul's text. I will now try to go over these really quickly. So you have a big picture. I'm going to start with the external because the claim is often made that there is no manuscript that omits these verses.
Right.
And that, of course, depends on the definition of manuscript.
Okay.
But I'll start with these 10, the 10 external reasons. First is transcriptional probability. Argues that 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35 was not in Paul's original letter. It's based on Bengel's first principle that the form of the text that best explains the emergence of all the other forms is most likely original.
Right.
There are only three plausible explanations for the text as we have it now. Okay. One is that those verses were originally after verse 33, and then they were moved to follow verse 40. The second is they were originally after verse 40 and were moved to be after verse 33. And the third is they originally were not in either of those locations, but somewhere else, presumably in the margin, and later copyists copied them. And because the length of text of 34 and 35 would pretty much fill a margin of a papyrus, it would be hard for a reader later, whether it's a side margin or bottom margin, it would be hard for a later reader to know where that's supposed to go, unless there's a specific mark connecting it to that text. And there are only two places in that context where one could plausibly insert the text. And that's either after verse 33 or after verse 40. If you look at those three options, it turns out that there is no manuscript of any of Paul's letters that ever moves any block of text nearly this large, this far away, without an obvious reason. If either one or two is the real explanation, it was a unique occurrence, as far as we can tell from all the surviving manuscript evidence. No other case. This was unique. Those who have said, oh, but here are other examples in Western manuscripts, they're far shorter blocks of text moved shorter distances.
When we talk about blocks of text moving around, the one that I often think of is the one in Romans, at the end of Romans, where
Yes.
I think it's somewhere near the end of chapter 12 and chapter 14 that kind of do the onesie twosie. So are you saying
Yeah.
that that's different than the movement that we see in 1 Corinthians 14?
Oh, completely. Because in that case, you have different endings of different texts, and the doxologies move to the end of the text. When you have
Right.
a shorter text, it has to move to the shorter position. So there's an obvious explanation in that case. And
Right.
all the studies of that, the data I've seen, have concluded that same thing. That the reason you have the different location is because in different manuscripts, the text ends differently. Point is, there's an obvious explanation of that case in order to make it fit the end of the manuscript. And there is no obvious explanation here in 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and
Right.
35. If there is a reason to move it, it's not a reason that was ever identified by any early church reader. None of them identify any objection with its location in the text. It's unique. But if we move to the third possibility, namely, it was originally written in the margin, and then later copyists had to choose where to put it, the two natural locations are exactly where they did choose to put it. I think that Ulrich Schmidt is correct that it was conventional for early scribes, when they found text in the margin, that they would put it into the body text. And the reason they would is because they're copyists. They make mistakes. When they make mistakes, they put the words that they missed in the margin. So they assume put text in the margin, it's their scribe, put it there, missed it by mistake, and so they put it back just like they put back their own stuff. We have to choose which is more likely. Something happened that is unique, and there's no comparable instance in any of Paul's letters, or that something happened that is conventional, and a reader and the people who usually write in the margins of texts are the owners of the text. And the owners of the text are people who had a lot of money, because one page of vellum costs a day's wage. Not many people could afford manuscripts. The people that could afford them were educated enough that they could write, and they would be the kind of person who, because of their financial freedom, their access to resources, would tend to be opinionated people. And if they read, I want all to prophesy, and if they held the standard conventional wisdom of the day, that women should not speak in public gatherings, then they're called the ecclesia. And here's the ecclesia meeting would say, want to clarify that this can't include women. It is, I do not permit, I'm sorry, let women keep silence in the churches. This is the standard convention. There were, I've come across laws that prohibited women from speaking in the churches. You have plays that are comedies because women take over the Senate. It's funny because it's so ludicrous. And so you combine this conventional wisdom and a typical wealthy reader giving that reader's opinion in the margin. And I was going to say but some women were wealthy too and had opinions too. Origen said he preferred girls trained in penmanship. So when we talk about scribe B, if it was someone like Origen hired, then chances are it was a woman. We don't know. We often assume but we don't know. And Melania got awards for the best penmanship of any Greek scribe. So I think we just be aware of that.
So if I'm understanding,
someone writing in the margin, if the third thing is correct, then it's easy to explain something conventional, a scribe putting in the text what is in the margin. If the text is originally after 33, it's very hard to explain how it could ever get after 40, because no manuscript of Paul's letters ever has a comparable change of location that far away of that much text without an obvious reason.
So I just want to kind of rehash that, make sure I understand what you're saying. So when we talk about that third option being a marginal reading, making it into the text, you're suggesting that potentially how that got in was perhaps somebody was writing down their opinion in the margin in this section of 1 Corinthians 14. And then a scribe came later. And then because it's his duty to preserve what's in the text, he came and put that into the passage right there, either between, is it 33 and 35, or at the end of verse 40? Am I correct?
Between 33 and 36, yes.
33 and 36,
Between
yes.
33 and 36, yeah. The only thing I would change is that instead of saying he, I would say he or she.
Yeah, right, he or she. Okay. Now, is it fair to suggest that there's a fair bit of speculation in that?
Well, whenever we're trying to explain something for which all we have is the result, you can call it speculation, but the more correct term would be deduction.
Okay,
you're
deduction.
Taking the data and you're saying, how can you explain this? See, the whole principle of transcriptional probability is a matter of probability. Is it probable that a scribe encountering a text with those words in the margin would put them into the text? There's a high probability of that.
Right.
Is it, if you come at the other way and say, if a scribe is copying a text with the text after verse 33, what is the probability of that scribe putting it after verse 40? You're getting near zero, because we have zero instances in all the thousands of manuscripts of Paul's letters.
Now, do we have any other examples of where a marginal reading knowingly got into the main text?
Oh, lots of cases. If you take the article by Ulrich Schmid, Conceptualizing Scribal Performances, Reader's Notes, in Kurt Wachtel and Michael Holmes edited The Textual History of the Greek New Testament, Changing Views in Contemporary Research, from 2011. It's pages 49 to 64, gives lots of examples. And he argues that it's most likely to have resulted from the work of a reader, not a scribe.
Okay, so let's move on. What was your second external criteria for determining that this is an addition?
The second is that Codex Fuldensis' text, as corrected by Bishop Victor of Capua, omits those verses. This is important because, number one, Bishop Victor was a well-established textual scholar, the most famous textual scholar of his day. He had manuscripts brought to him. He commissioned Codex Fuldensis to be written. At the end of it, he has two notes saying, I, Bishop Victor of Capua, and he gives the exact date, like April 8th, 547, completed reading and editing this manuscript. And then there's a second note on May 7th, 587, I completed going through the second time and making notes. So it's the first actual dated manuscript with a day, month, and year by the person doing it that has survived from antiquity. So we know the provenance. We know the original text.
That's a Latin manuscript, am I right?
It is correct. It is Latin manuscript. It's one of the earliest Latin manuscripts. So this is the second case. And this is important because it is clearly a manuscript that clearly omits those verses. Bruce Metzger has confirmed that was the intent of the scribe. The third is Codex Vaticanus. The Codex Vaticanus has this symbol of two dots and a bar with a gap in the text at the precise point where the interrupting words interrupt the original text. It's a symbol which occurs 15 times in the New Testament where there's a gap. We know that the meaning was understood by at least one other scribe, because there is a 16th case where there's also a distigme obolis, but both dots in the bar have downward dipping ink from both dots and the bar, unlike the other 15, and that's the only case where there is no gap in the text.
Right.
And so a later scribe could not insert a gap. So we have a symbol that occurs with these 5 characteristics of the bar, and that in every case, it marks text that surviving manuscripts have included text that is in every case widely regarded by scholars as being spurious added text. You have, one might say, how does one avoid the evidence? One first says, no, it doesn't exist. There is no distigma obolis. Well, it may be that in the future, it will be proved that the distigma is not original. It'd be hard to disprove because it's been re-inked, and so it depends on getting under and determining that. But the second thing one could say is there is no obolus in the New Testament. Right. Again, that depends on the assumption that it's a paragraphos, but then we have the issues we talked about before.
Right.
They don't appear to be original. The fourth external evidence is that I believe I argued in New Testament studies that the most reasonable explanation of manuscript 88's treatment is that it was copied from a manuscript that omitted these verses. Manuscript 88 is very interesting because it goes from 33 to 36. And then at the end, near the end of verse 40, before the period is written in verse 40, the scribe puts 2 slash marks on the baseline before the period.
Right.
And then in the margin to the right of the end of verse 33, there are 2 corresponding slash signs. And then over the last letter of verse 33 are 2 more slash signs. If the scribe, first of all, we know the scribe intended 34 and 35 to be read after verse 33. These slashes make it indisputable that that's the intent. But what's weird is this is not a Western manuscript. Nobody identifies 88 as a Western manuscript.
Is this a minuscule or a nuntial?
88 is, let's see, I've got it right here. Here's an image.
Oh, I don't have enough
manuscript 88.
I don't have enough resolution to see that.
So that's
a minuscule. Yep, that's a minuscule. Yep, okay. Because I'm going to go check this out once we're done, right?
So it's a later manuscript. The entire text is not Western. There are 2 possible explanations. One is that this scribe was copying a Western manuscript, and so went from 33 to 36. And then when he got down to verse 40, saw, here's 34 and 35, and then later marked that 34 and 35 should be after verse 33. The problem with that is the markings don't fit that theory. If the scribe had copied the entire text from a Western manuscript, there would not have been slashes on the baseline. And even if the scribe had figured out, this is different, you would expect the slashes to be after the period, not before it. And you would expect the slashes on verse 33 to be over period or between the period and the first letter of 34, but they're not. They're over the last letter of 33. So the data doesn't support the interpretation. The other interpretation of the data is that the scribe was copying a manuscript that omitted those verses, and then when at some point, presumably at the end of verse 40, the scribe realized something's wrong here. I left something out, and then looked at another manuscript, and lo and behold, I was right. My memory was right. There was something else here. I left out 34 and 35. And as soon as the scribe understood that, the scribe put the 2 lines on the baseline and then realized, I got to put a period here. So period. Now added 34 and 35. And then because I marked the edition before the period, I've got to then put those over the last letter of 33 to make it fit. That would explain the text. The fact that it is not a Western manuscript being copied makes it very unlikely that that manuscript had those verses after verse 40. This, again, is external evidence. You have a manuscript, and in this case, the scribe is not trying to change the text. The scribe is not trying to move the verses. The scribe is trying to restore the text to what that scribe expects it to be. The fifth external, and the remaining evidences are evidences from manuscripts that one would not expect if that scribe's manuscript had 34 and 35 in the text. And if they believe that Paul was saying women are to be silenced in churches. Because if you have a manuscript that says let women be silenced in the churches, then you're unlikely to write a manuscript that contradicts that. The first is the Acts of Paul and Theckla, which reflects a text without those, because Theckla is preaching and she's speaking in church. She's the hero of the story. These are not things that one would expect from a writer whose text said, let women be silenced in the churches. The sixth one is Ireneaus in his Against Heresies, quotes, "For in his epistle to the Corinthians," and I'm quoting from the letter, Paul speaks expressly of prophetical gifts and recognizes men and women prophesying in the church.
Right.
So it's a reference specifically to Corinthians, specifically to men and women prophesying. And Peter W. Dunn, in his article Acts of Paul, argues this would not be something someone would write who believed that Paul wrote, let women keep silence in the churches.
So can I just jump in there really quick? So how do we know that Ireneaus, so today in contemporary circles, right, we take a look at 1 Corinthians 14, and we try to reconcile that with 1 Corinthians 12. I mean, that's another discussion, like how we do that. But how do we know that Ireneaus is not struggling with the same issue that we are today in writing about 1 Corinthians? Because that seems like an allusion to 1 Corinthians 12 and not to 1 Corinthians 14. How do we know that he doesn't have some sort of way to reconcile?
1 Corinthians 11.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. It's 1 Corinthians 11. It's about that. The reason we know that was a concern among the early church fathers is that all of the early church fathers who make reference to 34 and 35 acknowledge in the context the tension.
Right.
So for instance, Origen writes that Paul silences women, and then he goes on to say, we would have thought he would have permitted this, but here he makes it clear that you must shut the mouths of the women. Tertullian, on the other hand, says Paul can't mean that he's silencing women from prophesying, because we know from chapter 11 that he permits this, but he acknowledges the tension.
Part of me sees that and thinks, wouldn't the fact that they acknowledge the tension rather than suggesting it's not scripture kind of be in a point of favor of retaining the passage in the text? Because it would be a lot easier to excise the passage than to say, okay, it's there, I can't make sense of it, but here it is.
The people who are commenting on scripture are commenting on scriptures that they have.
Right.
And if the scripture you have includes the verses, you will try to explain that text the way it is, just like people today.
Right.
I hear people today reading these passages, and I myself, when I read those passages, I tried to defend they were original because they're in my Bible. Why shouldn't I believe them? But maybe I've misunderstood them. And it's interesting that almost every scholar who tries to defend the originality of the verses does not actually try to defend the originality. The scholar simply tries to explain how it could be interpreted that would not be in contradiction. In other words, they're not asking the text critical question, they're asking the hermeneutical question. What I find, now, interestingly, you have the same scholars when they look at the works of Josephus. And there's one passage in Josephus where it says, Jesus was the Christ, and he did these miracles. It's in every manuscript of that passage in Josephus that has survived.
Right.
But I don't know of a single scholar of Josephus who believes that Josephus really wrote them. And the reason is that they recognize that Origen said that Josephus was not a believer. He did not believe that Jesus was the Christ. And so any passage that depicts Josephus as saying Jesus is the Christ, it must be spurious because it contradicts what we know about Josephus. Now, the interesting thing is we have a comparable case here where what is being stated in some manuscripts of 1 Corinthians does contradict what Paul says, but no one asked the text critical question. They just asked the hermeneutical question.
Sure.
And I too did that. And for years, I defended one explanation after another publicly. And as I said earlier, I tried to figure, okay, maybe if we take 33b as an introduction, therefore, Paul himself qualifies it.
Right.
But not only was there no manuscript evidence for that, even if that were there, it could qualify the next statement, let women be silenced in the churches, in accordance with the customs in all the churches, let women keep silence in the churches. I mean, it's redundant and awkward, but at least it qualifies it. It wouldn't as naturally qualify the end of verse 35, where it says, for it is a disgrace for a woman to speak in church, even asking a question out of a desire to learn by a married woman who's mature.
Yeah, so if we come back to the Ireneaus example, then if we talk about the early church fathers not referring to the text critical question, but just speaking of, the hermeneutical question, how is it then Irenaeus here is a witness to this in a way when he's not speaking to the textual issues, just speaking to the hermeneutical issue? Obviously, Irenaeus is having some trouble reconciling the two, but I don't even know if he's having trouble reconciling the two. He didn't say so specifically. But he's obviously alluding to the passage where they're praying and prophesying in the church. So I guess that to rebring the question back, what value is Irenaeus here, aside from stating that he had some trouble reconciling the two passages because he's not speaking to the textual matter?
The question for which I am trying to find evidence is, what is the evidence we have for the text of 1 Corinthians 14 that was being used by these church fathers? And what I found is there's not a single apostolic father that ever cites these verses, even though they cite from 1 Corinthians more than any other New Testament book, and even though some of them cite from other passages around it. It's an argument from silence, but it's a pattern of lack of reference to something for which we have legitimate question. So what I'm asking is, because we know that none of the apostolic fathers ever quote these verses, and because the very first reference we have to them in Greek literature is in Tertullian, and the dating of his citation is variously 207, something like that. And so roughly 200. So the first citation we have of the passage is roughly 200. The question I'm trying to ask is, what was the text that these fathers had? And when you recognize, first of all, that once the passage is cited, it's always cited in the context of difficulty in reconciling it with chapter 11. And right. Some church fathers, like Origen, saying, well, he seemed to permit it in chapter 11, but here he makes it clear that their mouths are shut.
Right.
And you have other people like Tertullian who say, yes, he is calling them to silence, but it cannot include prophecy because chapter 11 is so clear that he's regulating the prophecy by men and women. So you start with that acknowledgement that from the very first, there is a recognition of tension. So when you find early church fathers who do affirm women speaking in church, then it's something, and they're saying this from a position of acknowledging Pauline authority. Whatever right. Paul teaches, we have to follow. The silence, it's not just that they're silence, it's that they are affirming women. So for instance, Ireneaus says, in his epistle to the Corinthians, Paul speaks expressly of prophetical gifts and recognizes men and women prophesying in the church. Right. See, that contradicts what Origen concluded from that passage. It's not a QED, but here we're looking for the preponderance of evidence, and it is external evidence. It's not from silence. We actually have these citations. For instance, Clement of Alexandria reflects the text without those verses. He states, woman and man are to go to church decently attired, with natural step, embracing silence, fit to pray to God. For this is the wish of the word, since it is becoming for her to pray veiled. Right. Such ought those who are consecrated to Christ appear, and frame themselves in their whole life as they fashion themselves in the church for the sake of gravity. Here he references silences, he references praying veiled. He obviously has 1 Corinthians in view, but he speaks of man and woman in this context. If he had a text without those verses, then there's no problem. But if he did have the text, then there's a problem.
Right.
Another one is Victorinus of Pattau in his Complementarian in the Apocalypse.
Sorry, what number? Sorry, what number are we on? we left at 6 with Ireneaus.
Number 8.
Okay, number 8. Who was 7 again?
So 6 Ireneaus, 7 was Clement of Alexandria.
Okay.
8 is Victorinus of Pattau. Okay. In his commentary on the Apocalypse, he reflects the text without those verses. Its citation of 1 Corinthians 11:5, embedded between two citations of 1 Corinthians 14:29, would be incongruent for anyone to write whose text of 1 Corinthians 14 included verses 34 and 35. Right. And here's what he states: let the prophets speak 2 or 3, and let the others judge. And he says, every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. And when he says, let the prophets speak 2 or 3, and let the others judge, whether or not the interpretation is consistent with the testimonies of the prophetic utterance. Again, you see the tension if they had in their manuscript those verses. Number 9 is Pseudo Clement's First Epistle to the Virgins. Number 10, it reflects the text without those verses. Professor Fernando Saravi argues that since this letter is addressed to both male and female virgins, he argues that it seems best that the author was not aware of 34 and 35. Quote, if you have received a gift from the Lord, administer it to the pneumatic ones, to those who know that what you say is from the Lord, for the edification of Christ's brotherhood. The 10th textual reason is the high incidence of textual variance in those two verses. If you take a standard critical edition, whether it be the Nestle-Aland 28th edition or Tischendorf's edition or the more detailed work of Reuben Swanson, there's like 4 or 5 times more textual variance in those two verses than in the surrounding text.
Sure.
And again, that is far more typical of a spurious later added text than for original text.
Right.
So all of those 10 have to do with data from actual manuscripts. The other side of the question is the internal data.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to cut you off right here. We're about 2.5 hours in, and I got a couple things to do still today. So I'm really interested to hear your 11 others. So would you be okay if we booked another time to do the 11 internal?
Sure.
Yeah, let's do that.
Sure.
This is already a tremendous amount of editing here. So yeah, so I'll wrap us up. And then I'll leave an expectation that you're going to come back. Well, thank you, Dr. Payne, for coming on the channel and discussing. I think we've got about 2.5 hours of recorded material here. So I'm going to cut away the chaff and we'll make it into some good form. And we will continue the discussion. I want to hear your 11 points from internal criteria. So thanks again for coming on the channel, and we'll talk to you later.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the privilege of sharing.
All right, brothers and sisters, until next time, we'll see you around.